Hello and welcome to the Switch for Good podcast. I'm Alexandra Paul with my wonderful co-host Dotsie Vausch. Hi, Dotsie.
Hello.
Dotsie and I have been really looking forward to speaking today with our guest because he's full of incredible information that people haven't heard other places. And so let me introduce him. Dr. Ron A. Thompson is a psychologist in Bloomington, Indiana, specializing in the treatment of eating disorders. He's also a consulting psychologist for the athletic department at Indiana University and has served as a consultant on eating disorders to the NCAA. He co-authored the disordered eating section of the NCAA Coaches Handbook, and he recently became a member of the NCAA Mental Health Task Force as the eating disorder representative on the committee. Dr. Thompson also assisted in the development of the Healthy Body Image Project for the 2010 Youth Olympic Games. His publications include the books Bulimia, A Guide for Family and Friends, Helping Athletes with Eating Disorders, The Exercise Balance, and Eating Disorders in Sport. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Thompson.
It's my pleasure.
Hello there. So I am maybe his biggest fan. I don't know, maybe his family is his biggest fan, but I am a huge fan. And I had
Thank you, Dotson.
It's true. And you know what? I have to say this. So Dr. Thompson's retired now, and he keeps trying to remind me of this because I keep trying to get him involved in different things for good. So we're really lucky to have him because he could have said, no, thank you. I'm going to go outside and play golf and work on my ancestry. That's what he could have said to us. So we're really excited that you said yes and you're here with us. But I met Dr. Thompson probably about 7 years ago. So it was towards the end of his career, and I had just retired as an athlete and was doing, because of my history in eating disorders, which we've talked about on the show, I was doing a fair amount of speaking at eating disorder recovery centers and fundraisers for recovery centers. And I specifically went to an event at McCallum Place in St. Louis, Missouri. Wonderful eating disorder recovery center there. And Dr. Thompson and his cohort, his partner, his friend, Roberta Sherman, were both there. And they had started what was the very first eating disorder recovery program for athletes. And I was so excited and impressed by this because to my knowledge, up to that point, and especially, in my recovery, there was no such thing as an athlete coming into eating disorder recovery and especially into a treatment center and still being able to move their body in some way, shape, or form during the beginning of recovery, right? So as you can imagine, it is devastating to go into treatment, but it's very devastating to go into treatment as an athlete, to come from basically 100 miles an hour to boom, zero in that first couple days when they say you may not exercise at all. You may not move your body. You may not take a walk. You can't do anything, right? And you've been maybe rigorously training maybe 7 or 8 hours a day if you are a top-level NCAA athlete or an Olympic athlete or whatnot. So Dr. Thompson and Roberta Sherman took a really deep look at this and said, there is another way, and we have to make room for there to be a new pathway for eating disorder sufferers in sport. So he and Roberta, to me, they're true renegades because they went up against a whole system that said, oh no, this isn't going to work. This is going to be dangerous. This is crazy. You shouldn't do this. This is going to ruin everything. I mean, really, I'm sure, and I will let him tell kind of some of the first comments that he came up against. But he's a real fire starter, a real renegade, and a real truth seeker. And he is on the side of truly helping people, not just going by, let's say, just kind of the standard ways that they used to treat eating disorders in sport. So he's the foremost speaker on this topic, and we're going to dive into it deep today because we, Alexandra and I, Dr. Thompson, we deal with disordered eating on this podcast. We talk about it, I don't know, maybe every other guest, and specifically the disordered processes that people have with their food, the toxic relationships that they create with their food, even if it's one time a year that they practice disordered eating or every day or, 10 times a day. It comes up and it's a part of what we discuss here. So this is, obviously a little bit more actual eating disorder. But I know, Alexandra, you and I were speaking before we even got going, and you had a really great question to kind of delineate between the two that you wanted to start with.
Yeah, and thank you, Dotsie, for that. That's very interesting.
My little speech, it was long, but he's worth it. I'm telling you, people.
I wanted just to start, Dr. Thompson, can you clarify what an eating disorder is? On this show, we talk, as Dotsie said, about disordered eating and eating disorders. I seem to think there's a delineation, and perhaps there isn't. So could you educate us?
Well, there is a delineation, and I think a lot of people think they're the same thing, and sometimes they are. First of all, eating disorders are eating disorders that can be diagnosed based on our diagnostic manual, the DSM-5, diagnostic criteria. Once an individual meets those criteria, they can be classified as having anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, or other disorders as well. But with disordered eating, the thing about disordered eating is that all eating disorders include disordered eating, but not all disordered eating meet diagnostic criteria to be classified as an eating disorder. Doesn't mean that they're not serious. Doesn't mean that they don't need treatment, because they usually do. And often, if disordered eating is not treated in some way, and these are disorders like almost any other kind, the sooner you get to them, the easier they are to treat. But if you don't treat disordered eating, sometimes it can progress to an eating disorder. I think a mistake that a lot of people make is to assume that disordered eating is not as serious as an eating disorder, but that's certainly not the case. Disordered eating can affect most major organ systems, just like an eating disorder can.
So it's just a matter of whether it's in the DSM? Is that it?
Well, in many ways. Disordered eating, we don't have diagnostic criteria for disordered eating. Many years ago, the American College of Sports Medicine, and I think it was 1992, tried to get ahead of this a little bit and to help athletes. And they were looking to try to discover disordered eating before it got to the point that we would diagnose it as a clinical eating disorder. Again, in an effort to get there early and intervene. And that's where the term disordered eating actually comes from, the ACSM. And then in 1997, they put out a formal statement regarding what they call the female athlete triad, and then another one in 2007. But again, for me, and I always take a practical approach to this, and people say, well, how do you know when you should go to treatment? Because for me, that's the real issue. And here's what I say. I take a very practical approach. If it interferes with your physical medical health, it's a problem that needs treatment. If it interferes with your mental health, it's a problem that needs treatment. If it interferes with important aspects of life, such as sport or school or work or relationships, it could benefit from treatment. So to me, it's not so much what we call it, it's what we decide to do about it. And again, whether it's a diagnosable eating disorder or disordered eating, I always recommend treatment, and sooner the better.
So that would put about 90% of Americans, I think, needing to have some kind of help. Because
I think disordered eating is very common, and I think unfortunately it's so common that it may be hard for people to recognize that they're doing something that's unusual. It's like with exercise. I think there are a lot of people who believe that the more exercise, the better. that you can't get too much of this good thing that we call exercise. You certainly can, but in our society, and I hear people all the time say, "Oh my gosh, you're exercising every day, 2 or 3 hours a day. I wish I could do that." No, it really sort of depends on the motivation for doing it. It depends on the body's readiness and willingness to do it. But I think it is harder and harder to find what I call normal eating. It gets harder and harder to find what I call normal exercise. I can remember when Pauline Powers and I wrote The Exercise Balance. And we were talking, and Pauline's a psychiatrist of considerable note, and she said, "Ron, do you know anybody that you would consider to be a normal exerciser?" And I thought about that, and most of the people that I thought of were not what I would call normal. Now, again, what does normal mean? I think with the advent of dieting and restrictive eating and different kinds of diets, and I think it's very hard for people to know what's normal. And I think the term now is probably a better term. It's intuitive eating. And basically, a lot of the dietitians are proposing this, and I guess it's probably what I recommend as well, that you eat what you want when you want. You don't overeat. You eat until you're full, and you stop. And all of that sounds wonderful, but I really question how many people actually eat that way, and maybe how many people can actually eat that way. I have a feeling that the number's not very high.
Well, not with the kind of food that is in our society, which is highly processed with addictive substances like cheese, sugar, fat, umami flavor, salt. It's really drugs. And so I like your definition of healthy eating, I'd like to say, because I don't think it's normal at all, which is eating till you're comfortably satisfied and stopping and not thinking much about food in between until you're hungry again. And not
eat when you're hungry. And again, most of the people that I work with or have worked with in the past, when I talk with them about, and the thing that I want to stress about eating disorders and disordered eating is that when we do intuitive eating or normal eating, we just eat and then we go about our business. But most of the people that I have treated will spend much of their day thinking about eating. Before they eat, they'll think about what they're going to eat. After they eat, they'll think about, oh, maybe I shouldn't have eaten that, or I ate too much. And so it's not just eating. And when we think about treatment for disordered eating or eating disorders, to me, more important than the actual behavior of eating is the emotions associated with eating or not eating. But maybe even more importantly, the cognition. There are a lot of psychological issues that affect one's eating, how we think about it, how we feel about it, our weight history, our life history. And I think a lot of people want to believe that it's a very simple construct, but eating to me is very complex. Exercise is very complex. And the interesting thing for me is those two seem to go together. I have people who find it difficult to find a balance. They either want to eat too much or they want to eat too little. And then when we look at exercise, it's the same thing. But the thing that's really interesting about this is, from most of my eating disorder patients, what I found is that the people who want to exercise the most typically want to eat the least, which doesn't balance very well. And very often people on the other end of the spectrum, and when Pauline and I wrote The Exercise Balance, we were looking at both sort of those who exercise too much and those who don't exercise enough. A lot of times the people who are eating too much are certainly not exercising enough. And it may be that as their weight increases, it makes exercise even more difficult and more unpleasant. But that balance or lack thereof has always been very interesting to me. My sense is that we have to find a balance with our eating. We have to find a balance with our exercise. Then we have to find a balance between our eating and our exercise.
I think it's for me, so much of it is a healthy psychological relationship with myself, because that's what was fueling the unhealthy psychological relationship with food. And I want to ask you your opinion on something that I think that is really important to kind of start with. And that is that I get asked all the time by either eating disorder sufferers or maybe the parents of, because I still do a fair amount of mentorship in this space. And I know a lot of treatment centers today are saying that an eating disorder, they're almost categorizing it, and there are elements, but they're categorizing it like alcoholism, where like once you have an eating disorder, always an eating disorder. And they're telling these parents, and this just happened last week with this family whose daughter is in treatment, and they said she'll never be completely recovered. There'll always be this seed in the back of her mind forever. And that was so upsetting to me. I know that I'm just one anecdotal story, right? But I said, absolutely not. I said, I can honestly say that I am standing here and there is not any time during any given day that I am concerned or worried or verklempt about what I'm going to eat, how much I'm going to eat, when I'm going to eat it, what happens after I eat it. If I do really enjoy something and I overeat a little bit, I don't obsess on it. I don't really think about it. It barely ever happens because it's more emotionally sound eating, I would say. But so please help us understand if that's true or not true and what your experience is. And can people really find complete freedom?
Well, it's a wonderful question, and it's one that's been around forever. There have always been people in the eating disorder world. I don't think so much the traditional eating disorder world, but there are groups that believe that an eating disorder is an addiction, and would take an addictions approach. I've never been that individual. My feeling is that when you're talking about addiction, you're really talking about something that's out of the individual's control. And no matter what she does, she's probably not going to be able to control it unless he or she stays away from whatever the substance is. The problem with that, and I understand that when it comes to drugs and alcohol, how do you stay away from food?
Well, there's certain. I am someone
you have to eat,
but you don't. You could also say, how do you stay away from liquids? I mean, alcohol is a kind of liquid, so you drink other liquids, and for me, I still have disordered eating. It's so much better than it was, and it doesn't consume my life, but I definitely don't have the healthy relationship with food that Dotsie does, but it's one specific food, and it's sugar, which is a drug. And I do want to say that I think that the processed food is a drug, and in that way there can be an addictive quality and a need to stay away from these kinds of foods, just like an alcoholic has to stay away from alcohol.
Well, there's probably some data that would support what you're saying. I certainly agree that sugar affects people's bodies. There's no doubt that there's a biological response to eating sugar. But for me, in the larger context, I have had so many eating disorder patients through my 38 years as a clinician who I believe have gotten well. So when I hear people say, oh, you'll never get over this, you will always have to deal with this, I have hundreds, maybe thousands of patients that I've worked with who would say it's absolutely not true. Now, are there still foods that they're uncomfortable with? I'm sure there are. There are foods that I don't like to eat.
Right.
But, I mean, again, that's a question, and it continues to come up. I can remember when I first started working in the field of eating disorders, there were a lot of folks who were referring to it as an addiction. The problem is that the whole approach that I've always done is to suggest to people that food is not something that is out of your control. It may feel like it's out of your control. And the whole approach to treatment is reestablishing control.
And how do you do?
Go ahead.
How do you do that? How do you help your patients? Because it sounds like you really have a lot of experience and a lot of positive outcomes.
Well, first of all, and I'm really bad about doing this. I generalize way too much, and I should say that as a psychologist, I believe in individual differences, and I really believe this when I stop and think about it. That every case I've ever seen, every person is different. They come into treatment. Oh yes, they may have this disorder, they may have that disorder, but their genetics are different, and we know that genetics greatly affect. Can affect this disorder. So everybody who comes in is a little bit different. And that's one of the reasons that Roberta and I got so involved with athletes. Our feeling was that not only is everybody special, but we have special groups. These are special subpopulations that have specialized. But even within that, each of those people is an individual. And even though I was trained in all different kinds of therapy, what I always tried to do was to figure out, okay, what does this individual person need from me individually? What's missing in his or her life? Often it was a significant relationship. But when you're talking about an eating disorder, you're going to have to deal with every aspect of the individual's life. You're especially looking at relationships. I've always believed that relationships are very important. And I think we have relationships with food. I think we have relationships with our eating disorder.
So you mentioned genetics is a predisposition, and it sounds like for athletes, environment might be one, and then personal relationships. What are some other factors that make a person vulnerable to an eating disorder?
Find out what they need. Now, obviously, if there's a genetic component, let's say they have a genetic predisposition, they're probably going to have to stay away from dieting. They're probably going to have to be very careful with their exercise. But again, the problem with genetics is that most of the people I've treated don't really know their genetics. And one of the first things I always ask, I said, anybody in your family ever have an eating disorder? Well, I don't think so. But sometimes when I said, well, the next time you go home, would you talk to your mom and ask her? Because mothers usually know those things. And she'd say, oh, yes, your grandmother had an eating disorder. My sister had an eating. So we find out a little bit. But again, that doesn't mean that you have to have the disorder. It means it's going to be easy for you to have it. So what we have to do is we have to find out. Once people come to treatment, to me, it's less important to what precipitated the problem, or even what the predisposition was. The most important thing is what's maintaining it. It's what we call the 3 Ps, and the other P is what perpetuates the disorder. And there will be something, maybe in the individual, genetically. There may be something in the environment. If you're an athlete, it may be the sport, it may be a coach, it may be something like that. That's contributing. So we have to look at all the different aspects. And so to me, treatment has to be as multidimensional as the disorder. And I think that's why it's so difficult to treat. I think that's why sometimes it takes so long to treat it. And why sometimes it really takes residential or inpatient treatment to get the job done.
You're hitting on such a great point that I think is important myth to dispel, because I know that you've probably gotten this a ton, and I always got it. It was everyone mostly thinks, and I get it, that an eating disorder is just a desire to be skinny. Like that's just pretty much like the sweeping, oh yeah, well, I just would always hear before, Dotsie, if you just need it, you just need a cheeseburger.
Yeah,
like if I ate one that afternoon, it was all going to slip away. And it really, for me, was the eating disorder was me acting out on my inner pain.
Sure.
And I used drugs as well. But let's say, so it wasn't alcohol, it wasn't sex. It could have been any one of those. I always try to explain that to people. Those are just different ways that someone that's suffering is acting out on inner pain. And I was acting out on my fear and my anxiety and my feeling of loss of control at that point in my life. So that's really helpful if you could kind of explain that and dispel that myth and why? Why?
See,
why is it
first
not
of all,
just about speed?
You know, when you were saying that, here's what you were saying. Dotsie, if you would just, and always watch for that little J-U-S-T, just, that sort of implies that it's simple. If you would just do this, and I hear that over and over again, and my patients, whether they're athletes or not, but if you would just do this, or she's just trying to do this for, and again, in a very simplistic, and one of the things that has frustrated me in working with the sport environment is that people want to take a very simplistic explanation. Oh, she's just doing this to be leaner so she can perform better. Well, that may have been how it started. But that's not what an eating disorder is about. Eating disorders serve multiple purposes and functions. And just as you were talking about, it might be this, it might be that. It could be all of those, and it could be something different at different times. In treatment, what we have to do is determine, okay, what's maintaining this disorder? That is, what purpose, what function is it serving?
I agree with you. People are not self-destructive, that we always do something for a very good reason. So you're saying the eating disorder serves your patients more than stopping it, and you need to figure out what it's giving them that they're holding on to.
Because if you don't do that, Alexandra, what's going to happen is they're not going to give up the disorder.
Right. You mentioned, because you specialize with athletes and actually are a pioneer in that area, there are so many sports that encourage the athletes to be lighter. Or jockeys, for example, have to be thin. And wrestlers have to make a weight group. And cyclists go up hills faster if they're light. And ballerinas are supposed to just aesthetically, and I guess it makes them lighter to be thrown around when they're women dancers and gymnasts. All these people benefit by changing their bodies. Can you talk about that?
Well, oh, sure. Yeah. For probably the last 25 years, there's been a belief in the sport world that the leaner athlete will perform better. It started out thinner athlete, and for a lot of people, they still believe that. It's what I call the thinner's the winner mentality. Never thinking about the fact that there are a lot of thin athletes that don't perform well. But if you look at the research in the area, the research is inconclusive as to whether lowering body weight, lowering body fat actually enhances performance in most cases. In some cases it does. In some cases it doesn't. The problem is that coaches and athletes believe that it does.
And they haven't figured out that very delicate balance between what's the right weight and my right strength and health.
Exactly right. They don't understand that the whole process of trying to lose weight can be so disruptive for a person that any potential gain they might have gotten from a biomechanical standpoint, from the loss of weight or body fat, may be offset by what's happening to them emotionally and cognitively. What I try to stress with athletes and what I try to stress with coaches is that sport performance is like every other human behavior. It's multiply determined. Now, how did we get so focused on this body weight, body fat kind of issue? I don't know. I think sometimes people look at other people, let's say coaches look at athletes, they say, oh, she needs to lose weight. If she would just lose 5 pounds, then she could run faster. That's not exactly what I call science. But there are a lot of coaches who believe they can do that. And I don't want to throw coaches under the bus. When I first started doing this, everybody wanted to complain about coaches. No, coaches are the root of all evil, and coaches are the one who are putting all the pressure on them to lose weight and so forth. And that was the case. But in recent years, now there's actually recent research to suggest that there's just as much or maybe even more pressure coming from teammates. So I mean, it's always there. It plays a role. But again, what I like to do when coaches say, the thinner athlete always wins, and I suggest to them that they take a look at Serena Williams versus most of her opponents. Let's take Maria Sharapova, clearly much thinner than Serena. I believe that at the last count in their matches head-to-head, Serena was ahead 19-2. So sometimes I'll just use that as a very concrete example. Look, the thinner is not always the winner. Serena is much stronger. She has much more power. I think in many cases more athletic. I mean, what about that? Doesn't that make a difference?
She remains agile and quick. Yeah. I think that's what the argument would be, right? Like, you wouldn't be able to be, and that sport definitely requires that.
Now, most people, when they think of eating disorders, they think of women wanting to be smaller. But you see men, and in fact, the National Eating Disorder Association says that 33% of male athletes are affected by some kind of eating disorder. What do you find in your practice?
Oh, that's another thing that's changed over time. I was in practice for so long that when I was early in practice, I seldom, if ever, had a male. But toward the last years of my private practice, I had several males. I don't think it's so much that we're seeing an increase in eating disorders in males. I think they've always been there. I just think we're getting a little bit better at identifying them. I think the athletes themselves are getting better at identifying them. I think we have more treatment now. I think treatment is more acceptable now to males. I'm not sure it'll ever be as acceptable as we'd like for it to be. One of the things that has always frustrated me a little bit is that regardless of the mental disorder that we're talking about or the emotional disorder that we might be talking about, women are almost twice as likely to seek treatment than are males. And certainly with eating disorders, it's probably not different. It may be even more disparate than that, in part because I think many males believe that this is a female's disorder, that I'm not supposed to have it. And if you're talking about in the sport world, macho males, it's hard for them to admit to any kind of mental health issue. But certainly one like an eating disorder, I think it's going to make it more difficult. I hope that continues to change over time. We're certainly seeing more male athletes, and they're out there. The interesting thing, you were talking earlier about certain kinds of sports. And one of the things I always caution people about is let's not get distracted by the fact that there are high-risk sports and lower-risk sports. The high-risk sports, I think everybody knows what those are. You mentioned some of the weight class sports, the endurance sports, the aesthetic sports. But what we have to realize is that there are actually more athletes, just in simple numbers, more athletes who are in the non-lean sports, football, those kinds of things, that when we look at the actual number of eating disorders, there are actually more in the non-lean sports than in so-called lean sports.
To hear a lot about the binge eating for wrestling, trying to make weight. Does it show up more in terms of binge eating and starvation, or some kind of cycle like that, or is there a difference?
Well, I think that's changed over time too. When I first started working with males, I think there were a lot of males who were doing binge eating and then were trying to correct the problem with strenuous or excessive exercise. I overate, so now I've got to take care of it. I've got to compensate for what I've eaten. But in more recent years, it seems to me that with this emphasis on leanness, especially in sports, but not only in sports, but in society, I think I've seen less binge eating, In the last few years of my practice, I saw many more cases of anorexia than I saw either binge eating or bulimia nervosa. And when I first started some 35 years ago, that wasn't the case. I was probably seeing at least 80% of the people were bulimic, about 20% anorexic. And to me, that sort of flip-flopped over the years. And to me, it seems it's more the advent of exercise. Again, when I first started, we didn't hear that much about exercise. But in recent years, probably in the last 10 to 15 years, I know most of the research would suggest that 60 to 80% of the people who, when they get to the acute phase of their anorexia, they have a problem with exercise. But I think it's a pretty significant number, and I think it has replaced. I didn't see quite as much laxative abuse. I didn't see quite as much self-induced vomiting, but I saw much more in the way of excessive, compulsive, what I call unhealthy or unbalanced exercise. And I saw that more in males because, again, that was more acceptable. I can remember lots of male athletes, like football players, who would binge eat. It was just a fun thing to do. And then maybe they would overtrain to deal with it. And I'm sure there's still quite a few males who are doing that. But we're seeing the more traditional eating disorders in males too, anorexia and bulimia.
I don't think men are, I'm pretty sure I know that men are not as emotionally and psychologically connected to themselves as many women are. So it's kind of like they don't necessarily put the psychological unhealthiness of an eating disorder in a category that's important. They're just thinking things like, I don't look sick, or I don't seem from the outside sick, so I really shouldn't go get treatment because they're going to think I'm nuts because I look fine. And sometimes people can have disordered thoughts about eating and even religiously follow, let's say, a really strict and severe, either diet or binge cycle, but they don't look a certain way, right? They may appear kind of like normal and average weight. Maybe even their vitals are staying pretty steady. So what do you tell these people who don't think they're sick enough because they don't look a certain way? They don't look sick enough to have an eating disorder, because that's a big problem.
Oh, it is a big problem. And I've had patients who are referred to me and say, I'm not sick. I don't look like those people. I'm not skinny. And I think while I wasn't really enthused about the last diagnostic manual, the DSM-5 that came out in 2013, because they removed some of the weight criteria for anorexia. They removed amenorrhea as a diagnostic criteria. I think some of the changes they've made in that regard have been good, because it sort of suggests that you don't have to be the emaciated, chronically underweight individual. I think that most people in the lay public associate with an eating disorder. So again, that sort of a practical list that I said earlier, when people come to me and they would say, well, I don't think I need to be here, I'm not sick enough, I would say, is it affecting your physical health? Well, yeah, I'm a little orthostatic. I'm kind of lightheaded when I stand up. Or are you cold most of the time? Oh, my hands are always cold. Have you lost your menstrual cycle? And a lot of times people will say yes and then say, but I still don't think I have an eating disorder. And to me, it really doesn't matter. I will even tell them, it doesn't matter what we call it. If it's, I said, does this happen when you're more depressed? Do you get more depressed afterward? Are you anxious around eating? Are you having difficulty sleeping? I mean, those are the kinds of things that I'm looking for. And if there's some difficulty there, it's going to show up. And I just say, look, we don't have to call it an eating disorder, but I think you could benefit from treatment. And here are the kinds of things that I'd like to work with you on. And again, what I do is I look for what function, what purpose is this disordered eating, ever how minor or major it might be. What are the purposes it's serving? And what I find is that the longer they've had the problem, the more it generalizes. They may have started it first to deal with their anxiety or their anger or and pretty soon they're using it for a little bit of everything. And that's one of the difficulties about not getting into treatment, because the longer you practice it, not only are you building up habit strength. Let's say you're vomiting, inducing vomiting, but you're also practicing mentally. And it used to be, I don't know, I haven't seen the statistics recently, but it used to be probably 10 years ago, people who came to treatment with bulimia nervosa had the problem for 4 to 5 years. Now, if you think about how many times they have probably binged and purged, but not only that, but how many times they've gone through the cognitions associated with it before, during, and after, you're really talking about sort of a monumental task in terms of treatment, because it served so many purposes. It can be an excuse for anything. It can be an explanation for anything. It can be a way to be angry. It can be a way to withdraw and not show up. It can be a way to, I can't tell you how many times I've heard, I can't get into a relationship until I get over my eating disorder. It's a way to deal with fear, or to not deal with fear. So again, multidimensional, and why in treatment, the treatment needs to be multidimensional. Take a look at it, because if we don't figure out what are the purposes, the functions and purposes, and help them figure out strategies, cognitive strategies, behavioral strategies, emotional strategies, for dealing with whatever those issues are without resorting to eating, food, weight, or exercise, then I'm not sure we're really helping them.
They might move over to another substance, because even though you said that there's people who don't believe that this is an addiction, it sounds like other substances act like the way we use food.
Oh, they certainly could. I mean, if you think about somebody who's using, let's say, using their eating disorder as a way to manage their anxiety, wouldn't be hard for them to figure out that, if you drink enough, you don't feel anxious.
So are there certain personalities that choose eating disorder? I always thought that I chose food because I was a good girl and I didn't do drugs or do alcohol. And then I just never touched anything that could be addictive, like even coffee, because I thought, well, I'm going to be an addict because I'm an addict, because look at how I deal with food. Is that true? Could I have just as easily been an addict to something else, but instead wrap myself up with food in terms of trying to solve my problems with it?
That I don't know. The question always is, for me, is how do people try that first time and then determine that it worked well enough that they're going to keep doing it? And that's really what an eating disorder is. It doesn't really, and I always talk to patients about this. I said, does it really work for you? And I said, well, what do you mean? And I said, are you happy? Does it get you what you want? Is your life what you want? Well, no. Well, then I guess it's not working for you. Can we make a change in a way that might work better for you? And you have to just create a little bit of doubt for them that what they're doing. And one of the things you just said, did I choose? I don't think you chose food. It may look like you made a choice. I'm a person who believes that eating disorders are not choices. They've never been choices. I mean, who would make that choice?
Well, but precisely because it does help you avoid, distract, change, focus, feeling control. It depends on.
Yeah.
So all those things, I think a lot of people would choose it because and also the dopamine hit that you get from food, and then it gets out of control. I mean, to me, I guess.
And the high that you get from not food.
It could be. But here's the thing. A lot of other people have probably done exactly the same things that you did and not developed that addiction.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's.
See, I always wonder about food. This is what I always think about. I think about this from my own childhood, and being 71, that's a long way back there. But I also remember my daughter's childhood, and I know I did this. I I don't have a specific remember, but I know I did because I've seen parents do it all the time. Your daughter falls down, skins her knee, and says, "Oh, let's get a cookie. That'll make it feel better." Or let's get an ice cream. I can't tell you how many patients I've had, and I said, "Did you have those experiences?" And they said, "Well, I'm sure I did." And mom might be sitting in the room, and she'd say, "Oh, yes." And then she'd say, "Oh, it's my fault." And I'd say, "No, it's not your fault." But I think there's something about food. I have a very good friend, Roberta Sherman, that you talked about earlier. Roberta has a sort of a chronic migraine condition. And she says, one of the things that I figured out is that when I have a migraine, I want to eat. I think food means different things for different people. And I think for some people it's relaxing. I think for some people it's exciting. I think for some people it helps them avoid something. It's a distraction. So again, I think that's why you have to look at the whole person. You have to look at their entire history. You have to look at, again, every aspect of their life to know where it might have come from. But again, even if we know where it comes from, that doesn't help us get rid of it. We still have to break the connections, the functions, the purposes that this disorder serves. That when you start, let's say you're using it to help you feel, to avoid your depression, that when you start to feel depressed, you start to think about food. And then you eat. And people say, well, why do I binge? And I'll say, well, think about this. If you're binge eating in order not to feel bad, the longer you binge, the longer you can keep that bad feeling away. The only problem is at some point you do stop, and then you feel even worse.
Totally.
But then what
every aspect of an eating disorder has what we call a compensatory. The compensation of a disorder is, I'm exercising because I ate too much. I'm going to have to purge because I ate too much. Whatever the compensation is, that compensation, and we need to know what that is. That compensation is in large part what holds the disordered eating behaviors together.
Yeah, so even if it feels like it's ruining your life, it's actually, on the other hand, satisfying some need in each of us.
Oh, absolutely. So what we have to do is figure out what that need is, and then put together some strategies and new behaviors, alternative behaviors that will also take care of that need, so the individual then does not have to resort to the old way.
Is that what you?
Until you do that, I don't think they're going to give it up.
Yeah. What are some practical tips, some practical knowledge bits that you can tell that parent that says, maybe to just help them calm down a little bit or help them understand it a little bit better, which you've done a great job of so far in understanding it. But yes, that's the question for parents.
Well, the first thing that I talk with parents about and and tell them, I say, this is not your fault.
Yeah.
Almost in every case, the parent feels bad. Oh, it's my fault. I did this, or I was a dieter, or I said this about her thighs, or and so I say, first of all, look, it's not your fault. It's nobody's fault. Eating disorders come from all of these different places. Why your particular daughter, we're not quite sure yet. We don't know enough about her. But the first thing that I want them to do is to take the child, male or female, to a pediatrician. You need to find out what's going on with them physically, medically. Most of the time, if it's early in the disorder, they're probably doing okay. But you need to know. And I think a lot of pediatricians nowadays are at least educated, some well-versed in how to deal with these issues. You can't do this on your own as a parent. You've got to have help. And if you've got a pediatrician who can help, maybe that pediatrician can recommend a good therapist. The child needs to be in treatment. If you can find, again, depending on where you're located, can you find an eating disorders? I always recommend a specialist. I think in terms of treatment, she needs a therapist. She or he needs a physician. They need a dietitian. And again, I can't tell you, I've had so many people say to me, oh, they treat individuals with eating disorders without a dietitian. I would never do that. They're the most important people in this process.
Because they help you relearn? Is that what, like you said, the behavior part? Because
because for most of the kids with eating disorders, they have an intense fear of food, or at least they think that's the issue. Yeah. And you can go on NEDA, the NEDA, contact NEDA.
Is that National
to find
Eating?
out,
what does that
the National Eating Disorder Association for referrals. You can go to the Academy for Eating Disorders to find referrals. The unfortunate thing about eating disorders is they've become so common and prevalent. That's the bad part of it. The good part of it is, given that, there's more treatment available. I think there's good books for parents to read. Gurza is the biggest publisher of all eating disorder materials.
Perfect.
And you can go to www.gurza.com and you can get complete layout. They've got all kinds of books for parents. But again, NEDA and other organizations have information for parents. I think what's important here is that, and I've seen this happen, sometimes parents allow the child to be in control. I think as much as possible, the parents have to be the ones who are in control. The child doesn't decide if he or she goes to treatment. Those are the hardest questions I've ever had to answer. Well, what do you tell parents? Or what do you tell somebody that you're concerned about to get them into treatment? You tell them that you're concerned about them and you want them in treatment, that you're not a specialist, that you can't help them with this. You wish you could. And say, let's just go for an evaluation. We're not going to put you in a hospital. Let's go for an evaluation. Let's find out what this particular therapist, this specialist, has to say. And then based on that, we'll make a decision about what's going to be best for you.
I think what I've learned today is that through what Dotsie and you have said is that we focus a lot on the food and the weight, and that is something that needs to be dealt with, but that it's absolutely crucial to figure out what's missing in their life.
Absolutely.
That could be filled. And that is a really important question. What is this outer manifestation of your inner pain? What is that inner pain? And to really look at that, because we focus a lot on the weight. You're too thin, you're too heavy.
And of course, weight is a distraction.
Yep. It is.
It's not that it's not important. It is important, but it's not the problem.
It's the symptom of the pain.
It's the symptom. That's exactly right. And if you just keep chasing symptoms, you never get the problem. Is there a transition? My feeling always was about transitions in life is that if you think about puberty, the biggest transition we go through, that's when most eating disorders begin. Still a great proportion, too big a portion of individuals with eating disorders. Many have been sexually abused as children.
It's like 30 up to 30 to 40%.
Yeah,
I've read
exactly.
multiple times.
Yeah.
Common.
So, I mean, if you think about those issues, I mean, if you think about it, let's say somebody who's been sexually abused as a child. Okay, there we've got some information that would suggest to us that I'm not going to like this body.
Yeah.
I'm going to have some control issues with my body. I'm going to set firm boundaries about my body. I've got to change it in some way. So, I mean, some of those things make sense. But if you just focus on the weight, you'll never get there.
Thank you so much. And anybody out there that has even more questions for Dr. Thompson, send us those at info@switchforgood, because we can have him back on. We can do that. We can pull him out of retirement another day and have him again. And
well, it's easy to come out of retirement because I'm not busy.
Okay, good. Well, it's enjoyable to be with you. And I think we covered a lot, but I'm sure there's stuff, Alexandra, that we just didn't even ask that people were thinking, and they're just chomping at the bit. So let us know, and we'll get those topics covered. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Mwah. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
So thank you so much for tuning in today. If we helped you in any way, then click the subscribe button and let's keep hanging out together. We have so much more to share with you.
And if you need more information on actually making the switch for good, please visit us at switchforgood.org for loads of info. And you can subscribe to our mailing list where you will receive all sorts of super cool gifts, discount codes to our very fave dairy-free products, and a lifetime of powerful health tips.
So join us on the journey to switch for good. This is the future.